Hello, and welcome to today's session on depth perception. Today we're going to be talking about depth perception in a way of continuing our ongoing conversations of different aspects of visual perception. For example, we've talked previously about object perception, we've talked about form perception, we've talked about color perception. Today we're going to focus on depth perception. Specifically, we'll be talking about monocular and binocular depth cues. Most of our time we'll be talking about binocular depth cues, and we'll understand this concept called retinal disparity. Just so that we're all clear about the concept that we're going to be discussing today, this is the aspect of spatial vision that describes position along the z dimension, the dimension that's separating you from me as you're watching this video. So we'll talk a little bit about monocular cues, and then we'll talk a lot about binocular depth cues, and try to understand a relatively difficult concept called retinal disparities. Okay, so let's begin with a fundamental problem in perception. And the problem might be stated this way. How do we recover a 3D world from a 2D retinal image? Some of you might remember that in prior conversations, we've talked about the distal stimulus out there in the real world, and the proximal stimulus, which is here on our central nervous system. Out there in the real world, we know that space has 3 dimensions. There's the x dimension, the y dimension, and the z dimension, as we described earlier. Unfortunately, all of that distal information tends to land on a flat retina that we have in each of our eyes. So we actually lose in each eye one full dimension of space. We have only 2 dimensions represented on any one retina. And the question becomes, how do we recover that 3rd dimension? This is a fundamental problem in visual perception. Some of you might recall that we've had some prior conversation about an issue called the poverty of the stimulus. And there we had noticed that sometimes the information that lands on our nervous system is, relatively speaking, impoverished. That is to say, it underspecifies and underregulates all the possibilities that could be out there in the real world. And we have to somehow figure out how to recover what's going on in the real world based on a relatively underspecified proximal stimulus. And that's the case very much here in our conversation today on depth perception. We'll talk a little bit about a monocular depth cue. A monocular depth cue is information about depth that is available even in just one eye's view. And some of these are very, very simple. They almost are self-explanatory. One simple example of a monocular depth cue is the depth cue called occlusion. You might be able to see a small white patch here, but if I stand in front of it, I can occlude it, and that becomes occluded. This relationship between what is occluding and what is occluded is information about relative position in the depth plane that you would have available to you even in just your left eye's view or just your right eye's view alone. It's information available in either eye's view alone, and would therefore be a monocular depth cue. We can think too about what happens when we try to combine the information from the 2 eyes. And here we begin to introduce this notion called retinal disparities. That is, we sometimes can get binocular cues to depth, and we typically work with those by understanding what the differences are between the 2 retinal images that we would have. So to set the stage for that, let's just remind ourselves a little bit about how the eyes are displaced horizontally. For the average adult human, like you or me, the 2 eyes are horizontally displaced from each other by approximately 6.5 centimeters. My own interpupillary distance is a little bit different than that. Mine is 6.8, not too far from the average, but as my students like to point out from time to time, I have a slightly fatter head than I should, because mine are 6.8 centimeters rather than 6.5 centimeters. So that's the first fact about our eyes, and actually the eyes of many species. They are horizontally displaced. Okay? Because the 2 eyes view the world from these 2 different positions, there are positional differences in the images projected onto the 2 retinas. Okay? And you can do that yourself just by looking at me for a moment and closing one eye, and then closing the other eye and alternating between your 2 eyes one at a time. You'll notice that you get very similar information, but not identical information. Any given point that you might be focusing on in one eye's view will be at a slightly different location in the other eye's view. Okay, so we can think of this idea as the idea of retinal disparities. And these positional differences would be found even if you were to use cameras to shoot a particular object from slightly different horizontal positions. So let's go to an example of this. Here we have a couple of bottles that might be out on a table, and you might imagine that you can click the picture one time and you would get this image, and you might move over by about 6.5 centimeters or so, click it a second time, and you would get this image. Overall, these two images look fairly similar to each other, but we've taken these two images from two slightly different cameras, positioned maybe 6.5 centimeters or so away from one another. Okay? The gap in the left image differs measurably, although slightly, from the gap in the right image. So to make this very salient to you on the video, what I've done is I've taken, in this case, a little red marker that I've created in PowerPoint, and I've put it right up against the leftward bottle, and you might notice that that red marker doesn't go all the way to the second bottle. It goes almost all the way there, but the gap is a little bit large on this side relative to that red marker. I now make a duplicate of that red marker inside of PowerPoint. I slide it over here, and the red marker comfortably covers the distance between the left and right bottles over here. So as similar as these two images might look to you, we can see through this simple example of the red marker inside of PowerPoint that we actually have two slightly different eye views, and these two views might provide retinal disparity information that your brain could use to compute relative depth. Okay? So the difference between the gaps in the left and right images would occur, for example, if the right bottle were nearer to you in depth than the left bottle had been. Okay? Let's see a couple of new pairs of images in which interocular differences specify depth. Okay? So during class, when we're discussing this video, we'll have a couple of handouts, and this is one that the students enjoy every year. And this will be the very first handout that we're going to have, the top page. And we have some simple geometric shapes in what we're labeling the left eye's view, and those same geometric shapes in what we're calling the right eye's view. If you're viewing this with naked eyes, then the left eye's view will actually hit both of your eyes, and the quote-unquote right eye's view will also hit both of your eyes. Okay? And we're going to try to engage in something called free fusing during this session. And we're going to try to combine these two images without using an optical device of any sort. And so this is how we're going to do that. We're going to give you an index card, and we're going to ask you to place the index card right between the two images. So it comes up just like this. It creates something of a septum that's going to allow you to look at this image and have the left eye's view stimulate only the left eye and not the right eye. And at the same time, of course, the right eye's view will be stimulating only the right eye and not the left eye. So we're using this index card as a septum to segregate the two images in the two eyes. Okay? And once we've got that going, and it takes a little bit of practice, this is a motor skill, you'll find that you can let your eyes relax a bit, and we're going to get a type of fusion that we in vision science called uncrossed fusing. Uncrossed fusing occurs when you've got these separate images in the two eyes, and your fixation is now drawn a little bit beyond where the image actually is. These two will begin to slide one on top of the next. It takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of relaxation, and they form a fused image. The two images will slide together, and perceptually, the central oval will appear nearer in depth. So this oval will come that way toward you, and that one too. If they slide on top of each other, you'll see a near oval and two more distant circles. Actually, one circle will be seen on the left, one rectangle will be seen on the right. Okay? So physically, these are flat. But psychologically, you'll see a near oval if you can free fuse these properly. It'll take a few minutes of practice inside of class. Okay, we'll see if we can take a look at the handout that has a bottom image, same kind of a thing, left eye's view, right eye's view. We'll do a little bit more free fusing practice, and we'll ask you what you see in this particular image. I'll try not to give it away. Okay, just a little note that I think you might enjoy. Usually my students have gotten a kick out of this particular slide in years gone by. So I am an S&P geek. I teach S&P classes, and I have friends who teach S&P classes. My wife teaches an S&P class. And when we go on vacation, we typically take 2 photographs of everything, and we take these 2 photographs approximately 6.5 centimeters apart. So if I were to take a picture of you, I would snap the first picture here, and then I'd go over to this side, okay? And I would take those 2 photographs, put them down on a table, or if they're electronic photographs, I might have them side by side on my iPad, and I could do this free fusing trick that we did a moment ago, and I'd have a picture of you actually in 3D now. And when you take such pictures across your vacation, you can review your entire vacation in 3 dimensions. It's really a lot of fun, and it's one of the geek tricks that we have in S&P. Okay, so I encourage you to give that a whirl. We might try to do that in class. We've done that through the years, and students have enjoyed it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about retinal disparities. The lateral separation between the objects as seen by the left eye and the right eye is called retinal disparity. And as we said before, this is a difference between the positional information on the 2 retinas. The perception of depth that arises solely from retinal disparity is called stereopsis. If we were to look at the Greek translation of this word, stereopsis would translate into solid vision, or depth perception is how you might think about this. And there are actually lots of different cues to depth perception. We can put all of those cues in one big Venn diagram, one big circle, and then within that big circle of all possible depth cues, there's a very special sublocation that we might call retinal disparities, and specifically we might refer to that as the stereoscopic region of the depth cue circle. Okay, so stereopsis is a very special case of depth perception, and it's the type of depth perception that arises solely from retinal disparities. Okay, we'll see some of the geometry that is involved in generating these retinal disparities in stereopsis, and it's going to start with where our eyes are fixed. So I use the word geometry because, as you'll see in some pictures, geometry really is the correct word, but I'm not going to ask you to compute any geometric angles in our discussion. I will ask you, though, to follow a few simple geometric drawings, and I think you'll find them very interesting. So we'll start out by showing you this very simple drawing. Here is your left eye, here is your right eye, and you're fixating to some point out in space. Okay? And that point is contained inside of a plane, as you might remember from geometry. And we have a special name for the plane that contains the point of fixation. We call that plane the horopter. And we're going to say a couple of things about the horopter. First, the horopter is the plane of fixation. And something else we can say is the horopter is the so-called plane of zero disparity. And here, when we're talking about zero disparity, we're talking about retinal disparities. This is the point at which we have no retinal disparities. And that'll become clear in just a moment. Okay? So once again, the horopter is the plane of zero disparity. Remember that light travels in straight lines. So here's the fixation point. We have light traveling in straight lines to here, and light traveling in straight lines to here. Here's the horopter, the plane that contains the fixation point. It's the plane of zero disparity. All objects on the horopter project to corresponding retinal points. And to make that really obvious, we'll introduce this picture. Okay? So here, we're going to say that corresponding retinal points are at zero disparity, or they're equal to zero disparity. And in these 2 eye views that we have, the left eye and the right eye, we have corresponding retinal points. Point A corresponds to point A prime over here. Point B corresponds to point B prime. And point F, which is directly opposite the center of that eye, is corresponding to point F prime directly opposite the center of that eye. So you can see that you can slide these 2 right on top of each other. A would be on A prime, B would be on top of B prime, F would be on top of F prime. So to determine corresponding retinal points, we can slide one eye's view on top of the other. Okay? Let's see if we can now apply that to a slightly more complicated case. And then after we think we've got this one down, we'll go on to an even more complicated case. So here's our horopter. This is the plane of zero disparity. And as always, we have a fixation point. And now we're going to say that Ralph is at our fixation point. Okay? So Ralph, shown here in dotted line, is going to project to point F. Okay? And Ralph, shown here in dotted line, will project to point F prime. And those are corresponding points on the 2 eyes. We could take a different person who's also positioned very conveniently in this diagram on the horopter, and we'll go with Harry. Harry now projects, because light travels in straight lines, over to point A, and Harry is projecting to point A prime. Notice that point A and A prime are both left of point F in this case. We can go to Susan, who is also on our horopter, the plane of zero disparity. Susan is projecting to point G prime in the right eye, and to point G in the left eye. So here we have AFG, here we have A prime, F prime, G prime, but the letters are in the same sequence on those 2. We can rotate these 2, slide them one on top of each other. A prime would be on top of A, F prime would be on top of F, and G prime would be on top of G. Okay, so all of these points are on the horopter, and they're projecting to corresponding retinal points. Okay, so we have zero disparity or zero difference between the positional information in the left eye and the positional information in the right eye. Okay. Now what we're going to do is make the diagrams just a little bit more complicated by adding something a little bit more realistic, and that is stimuli that are positioned at varying degrees in depth for any given fixation that we might have. We were cheating a moment ago by oversimplifying things and putting everything at the plane of fixation. Occasionally in the real world, you might be in an environment where that is true, but in most environments, you're going to find that for any given fixation, you usually have a few objects that are closer than that fixation and a few objects that are further. So let's see what that might look like with respect to retinal disparities. First, we'll remind ourselves that we're going to assume that the fixation point is P for fixation point. Okay, that's our point of fixation, and light travels in straight lines down to P over here and straight lines down to P over here. But now, in this particular case, we have a few other points. One notably is point C. It's closer to us than the fixation point is. And you might notice that C, of course, per the laws of physics, will travel in straight lines and project over to here. And C will project over to here. Okay? So point C, which is closer than the point of fixation, projects to non-corresponding points in the two retinas. That is, C is here and C is here. If I rotate this, I really don't come to corresponding points. Instead, I come to non-corresponding points. Okay? Just to see that a little bit more clearly, we'll take a related example. All points closer than fixation generate cross disparities. So we can take point C, or any point that is closer than fixation, and we're going to generate points from C that are further out away from the fixation point, as we see here. So point C generates so-called cross disparities. You'd have to cross your eyes to look at the closer object to change fixation from P to C. So you're looking first at P. If you were to look at C, you'd have to cross your eyes. And in order to appreciate crossed disparities, I'm going to ask you to do this with me. If you'll now put everything down, put down your writing implement, and we're going to pretend that this is one eye's view, and this is the other eye's view, and we're fixating a particular point out there in space. And then what we're going to do is cross our eyes to see something nearer to us in space. So I'm going to go nearer to me, okay? And in order to go from here to here, I have to cross my eyes more than I'm already crossing at the fixation point. Okay? And these points that are closer to us than the fixation point are going to generate a kind of retinal disparity that we call crossed disparities. We can also play the game in the opposite direction. As always, here's P, our fixation point, and some points are going to be further than our fixation point, okay? And all points further than fixation generate so-called uncrossed disparities, okay? Point F generates uncrossed disparities. You'd have to uncross your eyes to look at the further object to change fixation from P out to F. So we'll do it this way. Put our implements down one more time. We'll assume that we're fixating with our two eyes at some point right about here. And as we said a moment ago, I'd have to cross my eyes to get to a closer point, but I'd have to uncross my eyes to get to a more distant point. So here's fixation. I would uncross to get to a further point out there. And the retinal disparities that are generated by points that are further than fixation are said to be uncrossed disparities. Okay, so that was a lot of information, a lot about disparities. Let's see if we can begin to wrap that up and give you a nice clean summary. So first, we have the fixation plane. We call that the horopter. It's also our plane of zero disparity. Here are the two eyes, right eye's view, left eye's view. And for the moment, we're fixating right where that point is. Uncrossed disparities would be further away than our plane of fixation. I'd have to uncross my eyes to see further than my current fixation point. Cross disparities are going to be requiring me to cross my eyes like this to get to some point over here. Points further than fixation generate quote-unquote uncrossed disparities. Points nearer than fixation generate crossed disparities. And objects on the horopter, anywhere on that plane, if we're fixating there, they project to corresponding retinal points and they have zero disparity. So sometimes we have corresponding retinal points. These are said to be at zero disparity. Sometimes we have some non-corresponding retinal points. And so now we have some retinal disparities. Okay. So with that, we're going to do one more exercise that I like to do in class, but we'll try it here on the video also. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to turn my back to you while I speak and look at the board, and I'm going to ask you to do this with your hands. I'm going to ask you to make a fist with your right hand and hold it out this way. Okay? That's going to be your right eye's view. So let me see you wiggle your right eye's view and turn it into a fist. Here's your left eye's view. You're going to turn that into a fist, and we have right eye's view and left eye's view. And we're going to take number 1 on this slide, and it says that disparities are crossed when the left eye's view, that's this one, has rightward displacements, and the right eye's view, that's this one, has leftward displacements. That is, everything is crossed, everything is backwards. So I'm going to take my left eye's view, I'm going to move it to the right, I'm going to take my right eye's view, I'm going to move it to the left. My arms are now crossed, okay? And this is the arrangement that we would have respectively in our two eyes if we have crossed disparities. This arises when we have objects nearer than fixation. Let's do that again, but now for number 2. This is my right eye's view. I'll make a fist with that. This is my left eye's view. I'll duck down so you can see number 2. Disparities are uncrossed when the left eye's view has leftward displacements. So I'll take this and go to the left. My right eye's view has rightward displacements, okay? That is, everything is the way that it should be. I now have uncrossed disparities on my retina, and this will give us the psychological experience of something being further away than our fixation point. Right? Here are some questions to help you understand crossed and uncrossed disparities. Okay? So we're going to give you these 2 images, and I will tell you that they contain 0 retinal disparities. That is to say, what you have here in the left eye's view is identical to what you have here in the right eye's view. And we'll talk about these with respect to quote-unquote binocular disparity or retinal disparity. We use those 2 terms interchangeably. When we're talking about retinal disparities, we're talking about binocular disparities. Okay? And here's the potential pop quiz question. What change in the left image, that's this one over here, would make the circle appear near in depth? So let's remember what we're doing with our left eye's view and our right eye's view. How would we have to move these around in order to make this circle look near to you in depth? We'll let you think about that and jot down a potential answer. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just go on to give you the next related question. Same stimuli, but now a slightly different question. What change to the right image, that's over here, would make the triangle appear far in depth? So how are we going to click on this inside of PowerPoint and slide it one way or the next so that when we free fuse it, it's going to look like that's further away in depth? And just to give you a little clue, you might benefit by reviewing this. Okay? And we'll go on to our last question. Describe 2 different ways of making the cross, that's here or here, 2 different ways of making that cross seem near in depth. And again, you might go back by a few slides and take a look at what needs to be crossed and what needs to be uncrossed to generate a particular kind of psychological effect, like making something look near in depth. So as always, we hope that you'll think about what you've heard in this video and jot down a few ideas about what was really clear. That's always an important step. And also a few ideas about what was not so clear. And we'll have that conversation in class. See you in class.